At my son's funeral, my daughter-in-law gave me 30 days to vacate my house. I just smiled, packed a suitcase, and left without a word. The next morning, a visit was waiting for her. The police were at her door. This story is based on real events. Friends, write where you're from and how old you are. It's very interesting to know who's watching. Enjoy listening. I never thought that at my age I'd have to fight for my own home, for the walls I built with my own hands, and for the memory of the family my wife and I protected all our lives. But as it turns out, sometimes the real enemies aren't behind someone else's fence. They're the ones who drink tea with you at the same kitchen table, smile to your face, and call you dad, while behind your back they whisper that you're a burden and an extra mouth to feed. My name is Timothy. I live in a suburb of Boston, in a regular white brick house with a garden. I planted myself back in the late 80s when I still had the strength to haul cement bags, and instead of a belly, I had nothing but stubbornness and faith in tomorrow. Back then, my Julia and I believed this house would outlive us both and become a quiet harbor for our only son, Ned, for his wife, for our grandchildren. And that's how it turned out, just not the way we imagined. My wife is gone now. She left quietly, the way she lived, without unnecessary words, leaving me the house, the garden, an old dog who didn't live to see these events, and our son, already a grown man, an engineer, serious and reliable. Ned had a wife, Veronica, a realtor, a striking, well-groomed woman, always with a phone in her hand and a confident voice used to giving orders, negotiating, pressing people into a corner when she needed a good price. While my son was alive, we kept a respectful distance. She was a little afraid of me, respected Julia, understood that I had built this house, that every board and brick had passed through my hands. But the moment Ned was gone, everything changed very quickly. I remember that day at the cemetery, almost by the smells, by the sound of dirt hitting the coffin lid, by the way the wind tugged wreaths from people's hands, by someone holding a hot paper cup of coffee, steam rising and mixing with the damp air. That autumn was especially cold and wet, even though the weather forecast promised mild days, but that hardly mattered. A lot of people came. Ned was loved. He was respected at work, helped neighbors, rewired someone's house, patched another's roof, never refused anyone, and everyone standing by the grave whispered something of their own as they said goodbye. That day, Veronica looked picture-perfect. A fitted black coat, neat makeup, even her tears ran down her face as if she'd practiced in front of a mirror. She moved among the people, accepted condolences, nodded slightly, touched hands with her fingertips. I stood a little apart, silent, holding a simple wreath I'd ordered from acquaintances late the night before. I don't like pomp. To me, the simpler it is, the more honest it feels. At one point, an old friend came up to me, put a heavy, warm hand on my shoulder, and quietly said, "Hang in there, Timothy. It's hardest for you now. The house will feel empty, and old age is a tricky thing." I nodded, unable to find words, looked past his shoulder, and out of the corner of my eye saw Veronica step aside, lean toward one of her friends, also a realtor, and whisper something in her ear. The friend laughed softly, covering her mouth with her hand, and they exchanged a glance, throwing a quick look at me. I didn't give it any meaning then. Honestly, my head was buzzing, from the pain, from the thought that I had outlived my own son, from the smell of wet clay and pine needles, from knowing that tomorrow I would wake up in a house without his footsteps, without his chuckle from the kitchen, without his voice when he came in at night and said, "So, Dad, how are you holding up? Still alive, you old porcupine?" When it was all over, when the priest said his final words, people began to leave. Some got into their cars, others walked toward the bus stop. Veronica came up to me, took my arm, smiled thinly, almost forced, and said, looking me straight in the face, "Dad, let's go. There's a lot we need to talk about at home. Now it's just you and me, We need to rebuild everything from scratch. You understand? In the car, she sat beside me, scrolling through her phone, replying briefly to messages, sometimes repeating phrases out loud. No, not today. We're rescheduling. Yes, I'm in mourning. I'll call you later. I can't talk right now. All of it without tears, in an even tone, as if it wasn't her husband's funeral, but a deal that had fallen through. The house greeted us with silence, the smell of boiled potatoes the neighbors had brought and left on the table, and a light draft from a half-open window. I took off my coat, carefully hung it on the hook, went into the living room where Julia's portrait still stood, freshly wiped of dust that morning before we left. Veronica moved through the house quickly, like she was inspecting a new apartment she'd just shown to clients. She opened the hallway closet, looked at my old jackets, sighed, muttered something under her breath, went into the kitchen, checked the fridge. We'll need to rethink everything, she said out loud, not looking at me. There's so much unnecessary stuff here. Old junk, honestly. I sat on the chair by the window, put my hands on the table, feeling the rough surface we'd varnished together with Julia on weekends, and watched her move from room to room like the owner, while the real mistress of this house lay in the cemetery. The first days after the funeral passed in a fog. There were always people in the house. Neighbors came with pots of food. Ned's co-workers brought things for tea, sat around, reminisced. My thoughts were all tangled, and only late at night, when the door finally closed behind the last guest, did I remain alone, sit in my armchair, and listen to the rain tapping on the roof. At first, Veronica tried to show care too, served me soup, asked how I was feeling, but her eyes kept sliding over the room, the shelves, the closets, the old cavalry belts hanging on the wall, and I could see the numbers already running through her head, percentages, square footage, market value of everything I had lived with for decades. One evening, when there were no guests left and the house was just starting to settle into a normal rhythm again, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, placed her hands on it, laced her fingers, and said very calmly, in an even voice, "Dad, we need to talk seriously, without emotions, like adults." I set my mug of tea aside and looked at her. "Go on," I said, feeling everything inside me tighten, even though on the outside I stayed calm. "The situation now," she began, "is that it's just the two of us in this house. And it's big, expensive to maintain. Utilities, taxes, repairs, it all costs money, and we have less of it now. Ned is gone, his salary is gone, and I have to think about how to live from now on. I can't carry everything on my own." She said it as if I had ever asked her to carry anything, even though all these years I paid the taxes myself, handled repairs myself, covered everything related to the house. She and Ned lived here like guests, paying at most for groceries and gas. "What I'm getting at," she continued, "there's a good option. Please don't be offended. I truly mean well. It would be better for you to live in a nice retirement home. Nurses, doctors, everything close by. I would sell this house. We'd split the money. I need to buy an apartment closer to the city for work, and you'd be fine there, honestly, Dad. You don't want to be for us. Well." She hesitated, but the words still hung in the air, heavy and sticky. "A burden," I said calmly, looking straight into her eyes. She looked away, shrugged. "Oh, why would you say that?" she drawled. "I only want what's best for you. I can't constantly watch over you, drive you around, take you to hospitals. And there everything's nearby, doctors, pills, treatment rooms. You'll be looked after and we'll still see each other. We'll visit you, celebrate holidays, Christmas, birthdays, everything like normal people." I listened to her and remembered how Julia and I carried every single brick into this house, how Ned ran through the still bare rooms, climbed onto the windowsill, and looked out into the yard, where back then there was only a pile of sand and a couple of apple trees. I remembered how my wife and I sat in this very kitchen late at night, making plans, and how we even went to a lawyer once to make sure everything was set up so that no outsider could ever take the roof over our son's head. I paused, pretended to think very seriously about her words, even though the decision had been made long ago, back on the day Julia and I signed the papers at the notary. "Veronica," I said quietly, "let's do this. We won't decide anything right now. We already have enough grief. Give me some time to pull myself together, and you think it over too. Do you really want people saying that your very first idea after your husband's funeral was to sell his parents' house and send your father-in-law to a nursing home? Isn't that a bit soon?" She flared up, her lips twisting. People, she mocked. "People always talk anyway. Don't worry, I'll do everything carefully. No one will even know. But honestly, Dad, just look at yourself. It's hard for you. Who needs this garden, these endless beds, all these stairs?" I shrugged, acted like the conversation had drained me, stood up, carefully put my mug in the sink, and said I was tired and would go to bed early. But that night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the old armchair by the window, listening to Veronica move around the house, cabinet doors clicking, floorboards creaking in the hallway. At some point, I heard her whispering to someone on the phone. Her voice was no longer grieving. It was businesslike, confident, the same tone she probably used when showing apartments. "The house is big, the lot is good, utilities are fine, the railroad is far, neighbors are quiet," she said. "Yes, the owner is old, but I'll handle it. He'll agree himself. It just takes time. It's morning now. We need to wait a bit." I sat in the dark and smiled to myself, not an angry smile, but a tired, crooked one. A few days later, she brought her friend Joanne into the house, the same one who had laughed at the cemetery. They walked through the rooms, whispering, Joanne jotting things down in a notebook. Sometimes she said words out loud: square footage, layout, renovation potential, clearly already mentally cutting my house into rental units. I sat on a bench in the garden, pretending to work with pruning shears, while in reality, I was counting in my head how many folders I had in the basement, where the old purchase agreements were kept, registry extracts, loan statements, wills, the inheritance agreement, instructions for bank accounts. That evening, after Joanne left, I passed by the kitchen and heard her and Veronica standing by the window, drinking coffee and discussing me as if I no longer existed in this house. "Just don't drag it out," Joanne said. "There aren't many properties like this now. If you list it in time, it'll sell fast. You'll finally buy yourself a decent apartment downtown, without gardens and those old people smells." "I know," Veronica replied. "I just need to be careful. He's stubborn as a mule, used to thinking this is all his. But he's an old man. He belongs in a place like that, walking down corridors, not climbing stairs. I can literally feel all of this hanging on me like a weight. If I don't place him somewhere, I'll be dragging him along for the rest of his life. And I still want to live." They laughed again, clinked their mugs, and something inside me clicked. Not loudly, without drama, just clearly, like a switch. That evening, when the house fell silent and the TV in Veronica's bedroom finally went quiet, I went down to the basement, turned on the light, walked up to the old metal cabinet, opened the door, and saw neat rows of folders labeled in my own handwriting. Each folder was like a brick in this story, and I knew that not a single one of those bricks belonged to Veronica, no matter how hard she tried to settle into my house. I ran my hand along the spines, choosing where to start, and thought that maybe, to some people, I really was a burden. But those who think they own what belongs to others rarely read documents. I, on the other hand, am someone who spent his whole life making sure everything was done properly, so no one would cry later about being deceived. And at that moment, I fully understood that the game had begun. She thought she was arranging the pieces, but in reality, the board and all the rules were still mine. When the metal cabinet door creaked open and I saw those neat rows of folders, I even shivered slightly with a calm, dark satisfaction. Because unlike Veronica, I knew exactly what was inside them. The real history of this house, my family, and all the money she was now talking about as if it were her personal trophy. The top shelf was from the 80s, old gray binders, the labels in my handwriting faded but still clear. I took out the first folder, placed it on the metal shelf, opened it, and felt as if I'd gone back to the year when I still had the strength to run around the construction site, argue with foremen, and spend nights drawing the layout of the future kitchen. The land purchase agreement. A simple sheet, an official seal, my signature. In the buyer's line, only me. No Julia, no Ned, and certainly no Veronica. Next came estimates, completion reports, contracts with contractors, a receipt confirming I had paid for the construction in full, without any loans. The house was built in the late 80s, when Veronica was, essentially, still learning how to tie her shoelaces, and I was already choosing what kind of brick to use for the gable. I flipped further. Home insurance against fire, contracts for electricity and gas connections, water and sewage acceptance certificates. Everywhere the same name, mine, with the same initials, the same letters I'd been writing for decades while paying taxes and utility bills, going to the municipal office in winter, arguing over rates. Not a single mention of Ned as an owner, let alone Veronica. The next shelf was the 90s. Another stack of land and property tax receipts, year after year, from the moment we moved in until everything switched to new forms. Then the 2000s, then another thick folder with recent years, bank statements, payment slips, tax office certificates. I opened them one by one, like cards in a deck, and each one showed the same simple fact. All these years, the house had been registered solely in my name, and no sane notary would ever call it Ned's inheritance, no matter how often Veronica repeated that to herself. But the most interesting part was at the very bottom, in the heaviest lower drawer, where a thick folder lay with a plain label, Family Documents. I pulled it out with some effort, placed it on the old workbench, opened it, and saw familiar lines, the ones Julia and I had once studied together at the notary's office, even before Ned was born. Inside was our inheritance agreement, and, bundled with it, a will, additional instructions for bank accounts, and an investment contract with a large regional bank. Back in the mid-80s, Julia and I decided we didn't want our relatives fighting over money later, so we did everything in advance. We opened a separate account, gradually put savings into it, then invested part of it in reliable assets. The essence was simple, despite all the legal language. Julia and I were the founders and managers of this family capital. After her death, I became the sole manager, and Ned was not an heir with a crown on his head, but merely a beneficiary during his lifetime. In simple terms, we spelled it out like this: a monthly amount for education, another sum for rent and helping a young family, one-time payments if needed, for a wedding, a car, or other major expenses. But the capital itself and the real estate remained under my control until the end of my life. I ran my finger along the lines that clearly stated the house was part of the family structure, but legal ownership was registered solely in my name until my death. Only after that would the next stages of inheritance come into effect. Looking at Ned's standard of living, Veronica decided that he was completely self-made, that he'd built everything on his own, as she liked to say, and that he was even supporting me. In reality, everything was much simpler and far less flattering for her fantasies. Ned lived well because his parents had taken care of him in advance, and the money he sometimes used to help me with small things was originally mine anyway. It just moved in a circle so it would be easier for him to get started. I closed the folder, sat there for a minute, listening to the silence of the basement, and thought that the funniest thing about human illusions is how easily people believe what's convenient for them. Veronica saw a modest old man with a simple car, saw her husband dropping by with grocery bags, paying for gas, sometimes taking me to the doctor, and decided it was obvious. The old man was living off his son. She saw my gratitude and took it for dependence. She saw my silence and mistook it for weakness, and I was simply living quieter. After Julia's death, I had no taste for showing off wealth. I was still struggling to get used to the empty chair across from me. I went back upstairs with the calm of a man who knows every letter in his paperwork, put the kettle on, and sat down again at the kitchen table, the same one Julia and I had bought at a flea market in the late 80s. I placed a clean sheet of paper in front of me and slowly began to write. Not a list of what they wanted to take from me, but a list of what Veronica already considered hers. The house, spacious, almost 2,700 square feet. The land, the garden, the garage, the workshop, all of it already filed in her head under my property. The insurance payout for Ned, which she had already mentally divided into renovations, a new car, and a down payment on an apartment closer to downtown. The furniture, Julia's old china cabinet, my bookshelves, my son's collection of engineering manuals. To her, it was all just junk, but in her mind it already sat in columns labeled sell, throw out, replace. And finally, the funniest part, my dignity, which she had decided to quietly scrape out of this house along with the photos and memories. She had already taken Julia's portrait off the living room wall, explaining that it was too heavy emotionally. Ned's childhood drawings, which had hung on the fridge for decades, were gone. The fridge needed to be cleared. It would look more presentable. My diplomas and old certificates from the tax office, which Julia had once been proud of, were neatly stacked into a box and placed in the hallway under the excuse, "We're clearing the walls. We're going to do a proper renovation." She said the word update as if she were throwing out trash, not our lives. Then, a couple of days after the funeral, she brought home a neatly printed sheet from work, a plan, as she called it. I was sitting in the same kitchen with a mug of tea when she laid the paper out in front of me, like an inspector in front of a tenant from a condemned building. "Here, Dad," she said, "so everything is clear with the timeline." The sheet had weeks carefully marked out, with a date in mid-November circled in red. "By this date, you'll need to decide on a nursing home," she continued. "I'll find one, help with the move. Don't worry, I won't abandon you. It's just logical and convenient for everyone." Along with the paper came a stack of glossy brochures, smiling gray-haired couples on the cover, standing in front of neat buildings with flower beds. "Here," she tapped one brochure with her fingernail. "This one's pretty decent. A private place, Golden Sunset. They have availability, their own nurse, doctors, a dining hall. Price-wise, it's fine too. About $2,000 a month for a small room." I looked up. "And with my pension?" I asked calmly. "You do realize that's almost everything I get?" "Well," she frowned slightly, "there are lots of programs for seniors now. Benefits, subsidies. The government doesn't abandon people. There are options for people in your situation." "People in your situation." She said it as if she'd been paying taxes instead of me all her life, and I'd done nothing but warm a chair. "And food, medication, transportation?" I asked, just as evenly. "You're suggesting leaving that to the government too?" She shrugged. "Dad, let's skip the drama," she said. "I'm alone now. I can't carry everything. This house, my job, and you. I'm already being very generous, giving you a whole month to pack. Many people don't even do that. They just inform you, and that's it." Generosity, a month, programs for seniors. She laid it all out in front of me as coldly as she would present mortgage rates to a client. And I listened, holding even tighter to the calm knowledge I'd brought up from the basement. The house, the money, the documents, all still mine. And the only person truly hanging in the balance here was her, even if she didn't realize it yet. A few days passed, during which Veronica managed to discuss my deadlines, nursing home options, and the development potential of the land twice over the phone. By the end of the week, on Sunday morning, as I was fastening my old tie and getting ready for church, the front door slammed as if I weren't the owner of the house. She was. Veronica didn't come in alone. 3 more people followed her. Joanne, That same realtor friend, and two other women, just as well groomed, in expensive boots, with work tablets in their hands. "Girls, come in," Veronica chirped, without even glancing my way. "Look at this house, the structure, the layout, the lot. It's a gold mine." I was still upstairs on the staircase and heard one of them say admiringly, "Oh wow, those window frames, those cornices, they don't do that anymore." "Of course they don't," Veronica replied with mild contempt. "The house is old, late 80s, all original. My father-in-law built it himself, but he doesn't understand design at all. All of this," she waved her hand vaguely, "is old junk, a museum from the last century." I came down, adjusting my jacket, and saw them walking through the living room, snapping photos with their phones, jotting things down, inspecting my house as if it were already listed for sale, and the only question left was the price. "Timothy," Veronica said brightly when she noticed me. "Perfect timing. I wanted to introduce you. These are my colleagues from the agency. We're discussing the house." She said it in a tone that made me sound less like the owner and more like part of the furnishings, something that could also be added to the inventory. One of the women, the one in expensive boots, stepped toward me and smiled politely. "Timothy, your house really has character. You can tell it was built with heart. A lot of work went into it." "A little," I replied calmly. "Just my life, my youth, and a couple of decades of work." "Veronica told us you'll be moving to a nice nursing home soon," another woman cut in. "A very sensible decision at your age, and the house will be updated, modernized." I turned to Veronica. "Is that so?" I asked quietly. "Turns out I'm already moving?" "Dad." She immediately switched to a sweet, patronizing tone. "But we talked about this. Mid-November. You won't manage this house anyway. We'll find you a better place. Medical care, routine, everything as it should be. It's a natural stage of life. No need to fight it." One of the realtors cleared her throat nervously. "Maybe we should come back another time," she suggested, "when you've discussed everything between yourselves." "No," Veronica snapped. "Since you're already here, let everything be out in the open. Dad just hasn't fully accepted reality yet." "What kind of reality is that, Veronica?" I asked, resting my hand on the back of a chair. "Reality," she said, clasping her fingers like at a business meeting, "that you're almost 70, living on a fixed pension, in a house close to 3,000 square feet, with a garden, utilities, taxes, repairs. You know perfectly well you can't keep this up. Ned carried almost everything on his shoulders these past years, and now he's gone." I saw how her colleagues were looking at her, no longer as confident as they had been at first. "Are you sure you know what he was carrying?" I asked quietly. "Dad, please, not this." She rolled her eyes. "I saw him paying your bills, helping you, constantly saying his father was in the red again. He paid the property taxes, utilities, groceries, medication." "You saw him pay the property taxes?" I asked. "With your own eyes?" "He did everything on his phone, online," she snapped. "He transferred money. I'm not blind. I saw him constantly pulling you along." "And did you ever see bank statements? Contracts showing the house was in his name? Did you ever hold a single ownership document in your hands?" "We're not required to show each other reports in a family," she cut me off sharply, but the twitch at the corner of her mouth told me she had never seen any papers at all. One of the women shifted her weight. "Maybe it really would be better if we stepped outside," she murmured. "So you can talk calmly?" "No," Veronica interrupted, as if afraid to be left alone with me. "This needs to be said right now. Tom, you can't live in denial your whole life." "In denial of what?" I asked evenly. "In denial of the fact that you are a burden," she said, and the room went so quiet you could hear the old wall clock ticking. The word burden rang against the walls, and even on Veronica's face there flashed a moment of surprise, as if she were hearing herself from the outside for the first time. "I'm sorry, but it's true," she exhaled. Since Julia died, you've been on Ned's neck. He was too kind to say it, but someone had to. Supporting you nearly drove him to bankruptcy. He carried you, the house, the loans, the job. And now what? I'm supposed to take all that on? I have my own life. Her colleagues were already standing near the door, clearly not wanting to witness this scene. I looked at Veronica, then at these women who had come that morning to discuss renovations and were now listening as I was practically declared a freeloader. So you believe, I said slowly, that this house was inherited by Ned from Julia, and now you, as his legal widow, inherit it from him? Of course, she said defiantly. How else? That's how inheritance works. Julia died, the house went to Ned. Ned died, the house is mine. It's elementary, Timothy. I work in real estate, I understand these things. I nodded. I see, I said. You're sure you understand? Finally, she sighed with relief. It got through to you. Great. Then let's drop the drama. This is a professional discussion now. People here know how these things work. I turned to her colleagues. Ladies, I said politely, if you're planning to calculate or sketch anything here, ask Veronica for at least one document showing who actually owns the house. Then you can start discussing its prospects. Veronica's face went white as chalk. Timothy, don't, she hissed, stepping toward me. Don't what? I asked calmly. Don't call things by their real names? You just told witnesses that I'm a burden and that you're evicting me from my own house. I only suggested looking at the paperwork. Heavy silence filled the room again. The realtor in expensive boots coughed and exchanged glances with the others. You know, Veronica, she said carefully, it really might be better to sort out the documents first, and only then think about design. We'll probably head out so we don't interfere. I inclined my head slightly. Have a nice day, I said quietly. And don't blame the house. It hasn't done anything wrong. They left almost at a run, without looking back. I stood in the living room for another moment, letting my eyes travel over the walls where she had already mentally stretched new drywall and modern panels, breathed in the familiar smell of wood, old varnish, and something deeply familiar. And at that moment, I knew it was time to move from quiet internal lists to action. I needed to call Emily Thornton, my lawyer, the woman who had known every corner of my paperwork for years, as well as I knew every brick in this house. I hadn't called Emily in years, because when everything in life is done properly and on time, you rarely need a lawyer. But I remembered her number by heart, the same way I once remembered formulas in college, and I dialed it slowly now, as if checking whether my hand or my voice would tremble when she answered. She picked up almost immediately. Her calm, slightly raspy voice sounded exactly the same as it had years ago, when Julia and I first came to her to draw up our inheritance agreement. Back then, she'd seemed too young for such documents, but she quickly proved that age means nothing in this profession when your mind is sharp and your conscience is clean. Timothy, she said, and I could almost hear her eyebrows lift on the other end. It's been so long. How are you holding up? As you can see, still alive, I replied, but it looks like it's time to open your folders again. She was silent for a couple of seconds. Is this about Ned? I heard. I'm truly sorry. My deepest condolences. Thank you, I said shortly. Yes, it's about him, about his widow, about the house, and about someone deciding that I'm a burden and belong in a nursing home. I told her briefly, without embellishment but without leaving anything out, how Veronica had already set a deadline for my eviction, brought colleagues into the house, called me a burden, and at the same time confidently declared that the house had passed to her by inheritance, because that's supposedly how inheritance works. Emily listened carefully, not interrupting, only occasionally drawing in her breath a little louder than usual. Come in tomorrow, she finally said. Closer to lunchtime, say 2 in the afternoon, so we can calmly go through everything without rushing. Bring all the folders you have, from the very beginning, from the land purchase, to the latest testamentary instructions. Then we'll decide how to proceed. The next day, I left the house a little earlier than necessary, eager to get away from those walls for at least a few hours and leave Veronica alone with her illusions. Let her walk through the rooms, repainting the walls in her head, while I went to someone who knew exactly what was written in black and white. Emily's office wasn't far. She rented a small space on the ground floor of an old brick building not far from downtown Boston. It used to be a hardware store. Now there was a neat sign reading "Legal Consulting," and inside it always smelled of paper, coffee, and something else that reminded me of a library. I walked in, greeted her secretary, a young woman in glasses who had replaced the older one who used to work there, but kept the same level of order on her desk, as if she'd lived among documents all her life. Emily came out herself, as always without any fuss, wearing a simple dark dress, her hair pulled back in a bun. She looked at me for a long moment, the look of someone who remembers you young and strong and silently counts how many years have passed. "Come in," she said. "Let's see your treasures." I set the heavy bag of folders on her desk. She instinctively pulled the desk lamp closer, adjusted her glasses, and began sorting everything into piles, like an experienced mechanic with nuts and bolts who can tell at a glance which part belongs to which machine. She first opened the land purchase agreement, then the first home insurance policy, the utility connection certificates, tax notices, and then reached the very documents Julia and I had signed at the notary's office. Her lips curved into a very slight, almost imperceptible smile, not malicious, but professional. "Well then," she said, flipping through the pages. "Honestly, Timothy, you and Julia did such thorough work back then that I almost regret you didn't come to me more often. This is a perfect set of documents for sleeping peacefully." She looked up. "Let's break everything down step by step, so it's clear even to us," she said. "First, the house, the land, and all the buildings, according to these documents, were purchased, built, and registered solely in your name. No shares, no joint ownership, no relatives listed as owners. Is that correct?" "That's right," I nodded. "Julia always said one owner means fewer problems. If anything happens, the will sorts everything out later." "She was absolutely right," Emily said approvingly. "Next, we have the inheritance agreement you signed before Ned was born, and then several addendums regarding the child, his education, starting capital, support for a young family." She ran her finger along the lines. "The idea is simple. You and Julia created a family capital that is essentially your property, while setting rules under which part of the income from that capital goes toward your son's needs. But the capital itself remains yours, and after one spouse dies, the other manages everything until the end of their life. After your passing, yes, then inheritance mechanisms kick in, and the son truly becomes the heir to the main assets. But," she looked up, "the key words here are after your death, which, as we can see, thankfully has not happened yet." I smiled faintly. "In other words, Julia passed away. Everything that was registered to the two of us came under my control. I remain the owner, and Ned was only the beneficiary receiving certain payments under predefined conditions." "Exactly," Emily nodded. "And judging by these papers, he lived quite comfortably on those payments plus his salary. So yes, it's fair to say that you supported him, not the other way around. You just did it gently and respectfully, like parents do." She set one folder aside and picked up another, the one with the insurance documents. "Now, the insurance," she said. "Here is Ned's life insurance policy. Here's the beneficiary clause. Let's read." I had held that contract myself before, but it was one thing to know it and another to hear it read aloud by a lawyer. "The beneficiary under this policy is you, Timothy, and in the event of your death, your inheritance structure, which is also specified here." She tapped the line with her fingernail. "There is no mention of Veronica here and cannot be, because the insured event, excuse the wording, occurred after your wife's death, and as we remember, In such cases, all authority over the property lies with you. So, I took a breath. The insurance payout doesn't go to Veronica either? It goes to the account you designated, Emily replied calmly. And that account, according to the documents, is part of the same family capital, your deposits at First National Bank. Under the agreement, all funds received there are considered your property, which you may dispose of at your discretion. You may, of course, choose to help Veronica financially if you wish, but you have no legal obligation to do so. She leaned back in her chair and laced her fingers. Now for the most interesting part, she said. As I understand it, Veronica believes the house went from Julia to Ned and then to her, correct? That's exactly what she said, I confirmed. She also added that she works in real estate and knows how things work. Emily snorted the way doctors do when they hear advice from well-meaning neighbors. In this country, she said slowly, real estate does not transfer through conversations at the kitchen table. We have documents, registries, records of ownership. When was the last time you obtained an official extract? A couple of years ago, I recalled, when we updated the insurance policy. Perfect. We'll order a new one, but I'm almost certain it will show the same thing as before. The house is registered to you. No transfer of rights, no shares. Whatever chain someone imagined in their head, Julia, Ned, Veronica, that's a fantasy problem, not a registry one. She looked at me carefully. What worries you more, Timothy, the house itself, or how she portrayed you in front of strangers? I thought about it, but not for long. You know, I said, I built that house for my family. If Ned were alive and came to me man to man, respectfully with proposals, we would have sat down and talked. Maybe we would have split it, sold it, bought something else. I'm not greedy. But he's gone. And the person who lived beside him, who never built this house with Julia and me, now says I'm a burden and need to be pushed into a nursing home so it's convenient for her. That's what hurts the most. Emily nodded. All right, she said. Then I think we should make sure that the next time she starts talking about how you were living off someone, there are people around who hear not just her version, but the facts. Ideally, the same colleagues in front of whom she already played the role of the heroic widow freeing herself from a burden. She leaned forward. Where does Veronica work, you said? At Premier Realty, I answered. Downtown, near one of the shopping centers. They rent an office there. Excellent, Emily said. Then the plan could be this. We take the full set of documents, fresh registry and bank extracts, the insurance policy, the inheritance agreement, the will, and we go there. Not to her home, but to her workplace, where she has a reputation, clients, management, and colleagues who are used to trusting her words. I raised an eyebrow. You're suggesting a public showdown? I'm suggesting not a show, Emily objected, but a clear, calm, professional presentation of reality, and in a place where it will be hardest for her to brush it off. It's easy to declare herself in charge at a kitchen table and say, you don't understand anything. But if the same words are spoken in an office and you place the documents on the table, her confidence may fade, especially if a couple of colleagues and possibly a manager are present. She paused. I wouldn't focus too much on the moral humiliation, she added more gently. What matters isn't revenge, but setting boundaries. You are not obligated to live with someone who considers you a burden while laying claim to your house. You could, if you wished, change your will tomorrow so she receives nothing at all. Or on the contrary, leave her something, but by your own choice, not under pressure. As for the will, I said, everything is already in place. You remember, we updated it after Julia passed. I remember, she nodded. And while you're alive and legally capable, you can change it whenever you want. But I would suggest one small addition, so she has no illusions about your house and money. She took a clean sheet of paper, quickly wrote a few lines by hand, then turned it toward me. We can add a clause stating that if, after Ned's death, his wife does not maintain normal human relations with you, does not provide support, does not respect your choices, and attempts to deprive you of housing, you reserve the right to deprive her of any share in your property, except perhaps a symbolic amount, and direct everything to charity. To the same Golden Sunset nursing home, but not for yourself, rather for those who truly have nowhere else to go. That would be very much in your spirit. I looked at her and smiled slightly. You're clever, Emily, I said. That wouldn't be revenge. It would be a lesson. Exactly, she replied calmly. You're not taking revenge on anyone. You're simply showing that you have a will of your own, and that respect for you is not an empty word, but a condition under which people can count on your generosity. We discussed the details for a while longer. She called a contact at the land registry to order fresh extracts from my house and land, set aside copies of the inheritance agreement, the will, and the insurance policy, and made a list of everything we would need to take with us to the agency. When we finished, a neat stack of papers lay on the desk, held together with a rubber band. Next to it was her notebook with notes and my short comments. So, Emily summed up, for now you continue living in your home. You don't take any action, you just observe how she behaves. You don't even have to argue, let her say whatever she wants. Everything she's saying now is only working against her. Then, once we have the updated extracts, we'll pick a day, go to Premier Realty, ask them to invite her manager and a couple of colleagues, and say, you want to clarify the situation with your housing so there are no rumors or misunderstandings. And there, I'll lay everything out point by point. You can just be there and stay silent if you want. I nodded. I don't mind staying silent, I said, especially if common sense and the law will be speaking for me. The law has been on your side for a long time already, Emily replied. We just need to explain it to those who live in their own fantasy world. When I left her office, it was already starting to get dark outside. Streetlights were turning on one by one, yellow squares lit up in the windows of old houses. The air was cold, but clean and clear. Nothing like the heavy atmosphere at home, where every word Veronica had spoken in recent days hung like a thick web. I walked toward the bus stop, holding the folder with documents in my hand, and felt not like an old man about to be sent off to a nursing home, but like the owner of his own life, who had simply allowed others to think of him as soft and convenient for too long. When I got home, I found Veronica at the table. She was writing something in a notebook. The same nursing home brochures lay beside her, now joined by printed listings for houses for sale in our neighborhood. "Oh, you're back already," she said without looking up. "I'm just reviewing options so it'll be easier later. Don't worry, I've got everything under control." "I don't doubt it," I replied, and walked past her, carefully taking the folder to my room. The plan was simple, like a hammer, and just as reliable. Wait for the updated extracts, agree on a day with Emily, go to her agency, where Veronica felt like a queen, and calmly, without shouting or drama, in front of witnesses, put every piece back on its square so that no one would ever dare call me a burden in my own home again. The fresh extracts from the registry and the bank arrived faster than I expected. Emily called me herself, saying in her business-like voice, this time with a hint of satisfaction, that everything was ready and there were no surprises. "Everything is exactly as we assumed. The house and land are registered to you, the accounts are in your name, the insurance payouts go into your structure as well, which means all the talk about you being a temporary passenger here belongs in the category of fairy tales for adults. All you need to do now is come and calmly listen while I explain this out loud to people who are used to believing loud words instead of paperwork." During the days we were waiting for the extracts, Veronica didn't sit still. It was as if she felt time slipping away and tried to speed things up, pushing me with hints and direct remarks. One moment she would spread out nursing home brochures in front of me. The next, she would leave her notebook in plain sight, with crossed-out dates and exclamation marks, as if my eyesight were bad and I couldn't understand what she was getting at. One evening, as I sat in the living room simply looking out the window, not really thinking about anything, she came in with a cup of tea, placed it on the table, and sat down across from me, crossing her legs like at a business meeting. "Dad," she began in that soft voice she used to lead clients toward signing contracts, "I understand this is hard for you, that everything is happening too fast, but time is moving on. Mid-November is coming up, and you still haven't visited a single nursing home, even though we've already discussed everything." I looked at her carefully lined eyes, her perfect hairstyle, and thought about how much effort she put into looking confident and how little into being honest. "We haven't discussed anything," I said calmly. "You talked, I listened. Those are two different things." She sighed irritably. "Fine, let's put it this way." She switched gears. "They're calling me from Golden Sunset, asking when to expect you. I can't keep them hanging. People reserve spots in advance. You do understand that it could happen that there'll be nowhere for you to go, right?" I almost smiled. Me, the owner of a house I'd had since the late 80s, being scared with the idea that I'd have nowhere to go. "Veronica," I said, "have you even been to this Golden Sunset yourself? Have you seen how people live there, how they look out the window, how they wait for relatives who never come? Honestly?" She shrugged. "I don't have time to visit nursing homes, I have work. But the reviews are good. You've seen the photos yourself. Don't dramatize it. Many people go there willingly and like it. There's company, nurses, some activities." The word activities sounded especially absurd, as if she were talking not about elderly people left there by their children, but about a hobby club. "So that means I have no activities here?" I asked quietly. "The house, the garden, the workshop, none of that counts as life anymore?" "Dad, you take everything the wrong way." She threw up her hands. "I'm not your enemy. I'm just trying to organize everything properly. I can't afford to slip at work. I have plans. I have clients. After Ned, we're left with loans and obligations. I can't spend my evenings running you to doctors and figuring out how to pay for heating in this barn." I noted the word barn to myself, but didn't comment on it out loud. I just nodded and said, "All right, then let's do it this way. So it's convenient for you and clear for me. Let's gather all the questions about the house, my moving, and these nursing homes once and for all. But not in the kitchen and not at the cemetery. Let's do it where you feel strongest. At your agency, in front of the people who value your opinion as a professional. You don't mind, do you?" She froze for a second. I could see something click in her head, how she quickly decided that I had finally matured for a serious conversation, and the thought that it would happen on her territory gave her confidence. "At the agency?" she repeated. "Well, we can do that, although I don't see why your personal matters need to be dragged there. This is a family issue." "You made it public yourself," I reminded her, "when you told strangers that I was a burden and that the house was yours by inheritance. Let the same people hear the rest too. I want everything to be fair, without guesswork. You are an honest person, Veronica, aren't you?" The corner of her mouth twitched slightly, but the word honest, said out loud, left her no room to back out. "Fine," she said. "Come then. I'll let you know when we have a free slot. We'll talk if you want. I'll invite the manager too, so he's aware. Might be useful." The next evening she handed me a small piece of paper torn from her notebook, with the time and the agency's name written in her neat, rounded handwriting, as if I didn't know where it was. "Here," she said. "The day after tomorrow, in the afternoon, we'll have a window. The manager will be there too. We'll discuss everything. And please, don't make a scene. I'm asking you. Let's do this like adults." "Like adults is fine," I replied. "I am an adult, believe me." That same evening I called Emily and gave her the time and address. She only said briefly that she would be there a bit early, asked me to bring the full set of documents, not just the extracts, but also the old contracts, the will, and the insurance policy, and added that I didn't need to worry about what to say, because, as she put it, sometimes the best thing a person can do is simply be present while the truth does its work on its own. The day we were supposed to go to the agency was gray, with a light rain that came and went, leaving dark, wet circles on the asphalt. I dressed a little better than usual, not to impress anyone, but because I decided for myself that this day wasn't a funeral. It felt more like a thesis defense, when you bring your drawings and notes and calmly show that you did everything yourself, not by copying off someone else. I took the same folder with the documents Emily and I had neatly put together, placed it into my old sturdy bag, took my best coat out of the closet, the one I usually wore only on major holidays and funerals, and left the house a bit early. I wanted to walk to the bus stop, breathe in the cool air, and clear my head before stepping into the warm, coffee and perfume-scented world of realtors, where everything is measured in square feet, price per foot, and potential. I arrived at Premier Realty about 10 minutes early, so I wouldn't have to walk in shoulder to shoulder with Veronica. That, too, felt important. I didn't want to look like an accessory to her presence that day. The office was on the ground floor of a new building. Through the wide windows, the clean lettering of the name gleamed. Inside, it was bright. Framed photos of smiling families in front of brand new apartments and houses hung on the walls. Brochures advertising new developments stood on the counter, and a water cooler hummed quietly nearby. I opened the heavy glass door and stepped inside. A young woman at the reception desk immediately came up to me. Perfectly styled hair, flawless smile, the same assistant Veronica had once bragged about, saying half the office ran on her. "Hello," she said in a phrase she had clearly repeated dozens of times that day. "Do you have an appointment?" "You could say that," I replied. "I'm here to see Veronica. We're having a conversation about housing." The receptionist nodded and paused for a second. "You must be her father-in-law," she asked. "Timothy?" "Probably," I agreed, although judging by her latest words, I'm more of a problem than a relative. The girl looked a little uncomfortable and glanced back at her monitor. "She'll be free soon," she said. "You can have a seat and wait. Would you like tea or coffee?" "No, thank you," I said, and sat down on one of the chairs by the wall, thinking that in my life I'd already waited for far more serious things than a realtor who considered herself the ruler of someone else's house. A couple of minutes later, Emily came out from deeper inside the office. I recognized her walk immediately, steady, confident, without fuss. She was holding a folder and dressed a bit more formally than usual, in a dark suit, her familiar glasses on her nose. If I hadn't known her personally, I would have thought she was an auditor from a bank or the tax office. She came over, nodded, and pressed her lips into a faint half-smile. "Good afternoon, Timothy," she said. "Right on time, as always." "Is it ever otherwise with you?" I replied quietly. "I try not to allow it." She shrugged, then turned to the receptionist. "Please, as soon as Veronica is free, let her know that her father-in-law has arrived together with his personal lawyer to discuss her real estate plans. It's important." The girl blinked, clearly not used to that kind of wording, but nodded. "All right," she said. "I'll let her know." Emily sat down beside me, laid her folder in front of her, and placed a pen on top. "I'm nervous," I admitted, surprising even myself. "That's normal," she said softly. "Just don't think about nursing homes or the things she said. Think about the stairs you carried bricks up in the year when she hadn't even started school yet. Think about how you signed that family agreement at the bank, not for her, but for your family. You didn't come here to justify yourself. You came to remind everyone that life existed long before her." At that moment, the inner door opened, and Veronica came into the lobby, her heels clicking loudly on the tile. She saw us and froze for a second, as if she'd run into something unexpected. As always, she was impeccably dressed. Tasteful makeup, tailored pants, a light blouse, a thin chain around her neck. She wore that same professional smile she used for clients, but when she saw Emily, the smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "Dad," she said in a voice where I caught barely concealed irritation. "You're already here, good. But I told you this was a family conversation. Why did you drag a lawyer along? Do you suspect me of something?" "I just wanted," I said calmly, standing up. For our family conversations to finally happen alongside the law, not just emotions. Besides, you yourself said you understand real estate. So let's compare your understanding with the documents, so no one ends up embarrassed later. Emily stepped slightly forward. Good afternoon, Veronica, she said evenly, without a hint of a smile. We know each other by name already. I've been handling your father-in-law's legal affairs for over 20 years, and today we need to clarify a few issues regarding his home, your statements, and some misconceptions about inheritance. I hope your management won't mind if we use the meeting room for 15 minutes. Veronica was speechless for a second, then waved her hand toward the back of the office. Fine, she said. Go ahead, it's free. Just no performances, please. This is a workplace. That's exactly why we're here, Emily replied calmly. So you and your colleagues can continue working peacefully, without being dragged into someone else's fantasies about someone else's property. We went further inside, into a small conference room with an oval table. The walls were lined with the same photos of happy buyers, along with certificates, thank you letters, and a framed sign declaring Premier Realty one of the best agencies in the city. A man in his early 50s was already sitting there, solid build, neatly trimmed beard, wearing a shirt and vest. He stood up when we entered and looked questioningly at Veronica. This is our manager, Spencer Patterson, she said quickly. I asked him to be present so there wouldn't be any misunderstandings. Dad, this is my boss, and this is... She hesitated for a moment, looking at Emily. Emily Thornton, attorney, Emily finished calmly. Nice to meet you, Spencer. We shook hands, and he invited us to sit. Well, he said in a conciliatory tone, Veronica told me you have some questions about housing, about plans involving the house, something about a nursing home. I take it this isn't just a domestic discussion since you've come here with a lawyer? I placed my folder on the table without opening it yet, feeling the kind of tension in the room that comes before a storm, when the air is already charged, but the lightning hasn't struck. The issue is actually very simple, I said, and it's not so much about the house itself, but about who was a burden to whom, and who was supposedly living off whom while my son was alive. I'd like this to be said today in front of people who are used to working with facts, not pretty stories, and perhaps in front of the same colleagues who recently walked through my house, calculating how much could be squeezed out of it. Spencer frowned slightly and shifted his gaze from me to Veronica and back. All right, he said. Let's go step by step, so no one feels wronged. Emily cleared her throat softly, pulled her folder closer, opened it, and carefully laid out several documents on the table so everyone seated could see them. Let's do it step by step, she said. And we'll start with the most important thing, who legally owns the house where Timothy currently lives, and which, as I understand, Veronica has been referring to in conversations as her own for some time now. I looked at her, at the neatly arranged papers, and felt an unusual calm settle inside me. It's the kind of feeling you get when you're standing on familiar ground and know that beneath your feet isn't shifting sand, but a solid foundation you poured with your own hands. Emily adjusted her glasses, placed her palm on the top page, and spoke in that calm, even voice used by people who deal not with emotions, but with facts. In the small conference room, that voice sounded louder than any shout. So, she said, lightly tapping the top sheet with her fingernail, this is a current extract from the land registry for the address where Timothy lives, a house in a Boston suburb. The same house that, as I understand, has been referred to in your recent conversations as Ned's inheritance, and as an object you, Veronica, plan to freely dispose of. She looked up, first at Veronica, then at her manager. In the owner field, there is only one name listed, she continued. Timothy. The ownership right dates back to the late 1980s. Since then, there have been no transfers of ownership, no gift agreements, no division of property, no shares assigned to the son, and certainly none to the daughter-in-law. The house belongs to him in full to this day. Spencer leaned forward to see the document more clearly, scanned the lines, and nodded. Yes, he said. Everything looks standard. Single owner, no encumbrances, all clean. Veronica gave a small shrug. But it was still a family home, she insisted. They all lived there together, husband, wife, me. That has to mean something. For a family photo, it doesn't matter whose name is on the house, Emily interrupted gently. But when, as an employee of a real estate agency, you bring colleagues into that house and present it to them as an object you plan to dispose of, call it your husband's inheritance, while it has a living legal owner sitting right here that already affects your professional reputation and creates risks for the agency. She slid the first page aside and placed another on top. Now the second point, she said. Here we have the inheritance agreement, the will, and additional instructions regarding bank accounts, which Timothy entered into with his wife, the late Julia, long before you became part of their family. These documents were later updated when Ned was born, when he got married, and when he started his own family. She glanced briefly at Spencer. I won't overload you with legal language, she continued. I'll keep it simple. The spouses created a family capital, registered it to themselves, and set rules under which part of the income from that capital was directed to their son, for education, housing, and family support. At the same time, the right to manage all of this property remained with them for life, and after the death of one spouse, with the surviving spouse. She smiled faintly. Julia passed away, she said. Everything that was registered to both of them came under Timothy's control. From that moment on, he became the only person with the legal right to decide what happens to the house, the accounts, and everything else. I stayed silent, and inside I felt a strange sensation, like someone was finally reading out loud what I myself had once signed. Back then, it was about the future. Now, it was about today. Veronica pressed her palms against the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Wait, she said sharply. But Ned was still the heir, the only one. That's obvious. You yourselves said everything would go to the son when they came to see you. I remember those conversations. Julia herself said they did everything for the child. They truly did everything for the child, Emily nodded. Just not in the way you imagined. She picked up another sheet, this time with a table. Look, she said calmly. Here are payments from the family capital for Ned's education. Here is support for renting his first apartment. Here is money for the down payment on his car. And here, regular transfers when you were already living together to support the family. All these years, your husband lived well because his parents had taken care of him in advance. And yes, part of that money went toward the house, groceries, gas, and occasionally covering things for his father. But those were funds that originally belonged to the parents. They simply passed through his account so he wouldn't feel like a dependent. Something like confusion flickered in Veronica's eyes. So you're saying, she said slowly, that he wasn't supporting his father, but the father was helping him all along? What I'm saying, Emily replied calmly, is that saying he dragged you to bankruptcy, as you allowed yourself to put it, is at the very least unfair. Unfair to a son who, as I understand, never complained about his parents, and unfair to a father who remained silent while being portrayed as a freeloader. I looked down at the table and ran my finger along the wooden edge so I wouldn't have to look at Veronica. I suddenly felt sorry for Ned, who was now being turned, after his death, into someone who supposedly saved an old man from poverty, when in reality he had simply lived with the certainty that his parents were always there and would never demand anything from him. Emily moved on to the next set of papers. Now the insurance, she said. Here is Ned's life insurance policy, and here is the beneficiary clause. Let's read it out loud. In the event of an insured occurrence, the insurance benefit shall be paid to Timothy, or, in the event of his death, to his heirs in accordance with the valid will and inheritance agreement. She looked up. Veronica, she asked, have you ever held this policy in your hands? Have you seen these lines? Ned handled the insurance, Veronica snapped. He said everything was under control. I wasn't required to dig into it. We trusted each other. I was his wife, not an auditor. He did the right thing by insuring his life, Emily said. And he did the right thing by naming his father as beneficiary, because it all fit into their family structure, in which you, forgive me, legally are no one, no matter how you see yourself. Spencer shook his head slightly and let out a quiet breath. Veronica, he said, looking at her across the table, why am I hearing all this from your father-in-law's lawyer and not from you? You told me the house was practically yours, that your father-in-law was living there as a temporary occupant, that you planned to move him into a nursing home and sell the property. We almost added it to our internal list of promising listings. I took your word for it. She flushed. I didn't lie, she shot back. I truly believed that. Julia always said they built the house for their son. Ned also said the house would be ours. Why on earth should I have thought otherwise? They never waved these papers in front of me or read them out loud. Was I supposed to go digging through every line? No, I said calmly. You didn't owe anyone anything, until you started bringing strangers into my house and telling them it was already yours, and that I needed to be removed from it like old furniture, while at the same time setting deadlines and choosing a nursing home for me without asking if I wanted to go there. Until that moment, these really were family conversations. Emily inclined her head slightly. And this, she said, is exactly where we reach the core of the issue. She folded her fingers together. As long as you're talking in the kitchen about who owes whom what, that's one thing, and I wouldn't interfere, no matter how many hurt feelings there are. But when a real estate agent, using her professional status and reputation, tells colleagues and clients that she plans to sell a house to which she has no legal connection whatsoever, that's a different level altogether. And, Spencer, it's important for you to understand the risks this creates for the firm. She turned to him. Imagine, she continued, that you help her find a buyer, start preparing a deal, and at the very last moment, it turns out that the owner not only never gave consent, but actually planned to live in that house for the rest of his life. Do you understand what that smells like for the agency? His frown deepened. Reputation, he said shortly, and people starting to talk about us as a firm willing to sell houses without the owner's consent. Emily nodded. And also, she added, relatives running to social media, telling stories about how realtors help get rid of elderly people to free up properties. And I assure you, no one will care that you personally didn't know anything. In stories like that, people only remember the company name. Veronica pressed her lips into a thin line. I wasn't getting rid of anyone, she said through clenched teeth. I was just looking for an option that would be convenient for everyone. Dad would be settled in a decent nursing home and you would finally breathe freely, I finished for her, without old people smells and the garden. She shot me a look that mixed anger with something close to panic. You're twisting everything on purpose, she hissed. You want to make me look like a monster in front of my boss, my colleagues, this woman with the papers. And you? And I said calmly, built this house long before you were born, managed the accounts, paid the taxes, went to lawyers so that you and Ned could live comfortably, and kept quiet while you pretended you'd been carrying me on your back your whole life. Emily raised her hand, calling for silence. Let's avoid insults, she said. I'm not here to morally lynch anyone. I have no need for that. I'm here to clearly state a few things. She bent her fingers one by one. First, she said, the house you live in belongs entirely to Timothy. Neither you nor your late husband ever had any ownership rights to it, except the right to live there at the owner's goodwill. Second, she continued, bending the next finger, the money your husband sometimes used to help his father essentially came from the same family capital his parents created. Saying that he dragged his father toward bankruptcy is both legally and humanly incorrect. Third, she said, bending another finger. The insurance payout under your husband's life insurance policy goes not to you, but to his father, and it is he who decides how to use that money. The law does not obligate him to share it with you, no matter how harsh that may sound. If he chooses to help you, it will be an act of his goodwill, not your entitlement. Fourth, she said, no one has the right to forcibly evict an owner from his home without a court decision. And considering Timothy's age, length of residence, and lack of alternative housing, I would be very surprised if any judge supported the idea of sending him to a nursing home at the initiative of a daughter-in-law who has no legal ties to him. She looked straight at Veronica. And fifth, and most important, she concluded, respect for the person who gave you a roof over your head is not measured in square footage or market value. It either exists or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, Timothy has every right to revise his will, completely exclude you from the list of heirs, and also limit your right to live in this house. A heavy silence hung in the room. You could hear someone walking past the door in the hallway, a light switch clicking in a nearby office, Spencer clearing his throat softly. Veronica broke the silence. "So what now?" she asked in a strained voice. "You're going to throw me out onto the street? Right now? After everything I've been through? After my husband's death? You want me to be left with nothing?" For the first time, real emotion broke through her voice. Not staged outrage, but fear, hurt, confusion. I sighed. "I'm not going to throw you out into the street with a suitcase in the middle of the night," I said calmly. "I'm simply no longer going to pretend you have rights you don't actually have, or tolerate you giving orders in a house that has nothing to do with you, except for the fact that my son loved you and wanted you to be comfortable." Emily leaned slightly toward me. "We discussed this with Timothy," she said, now addressing Spencer. "He intends to act within the law and in a humane way. No one is evicting Veronica tomorrow, but she will receive written notice clearly stating that her right to live there is not indefinite and that the owner requires the house to be vacated within a reasonable time. If she refuses, only then could the matter go to court. But I truly hope it doesn't come to that. It's unpleasant for everyone." "A reasonable time," Spencer repeated. "What does that mean, in your view?" "No less than a couple of months," Emily replied. "That's more than enough time for an able-bodied adult with a profession and connections in real estate to find alternative housing. And I'm sure you, as a manager, can also help her find an option that fits her financial situation." Veronica straightened sharply. "So you expect me to pack up and leave the house I lived in with my husband for all these years, in a couple of months?" Her voice trembled. "And you?" She shot a look at Spencer. "Are you on their side too? You can't support me?" He stayed silent for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "Veronica," he said, "I value you as an employee. You work well with clients, your numbers are strong, but as a manager, I can't ignore what I've just heard. This isn't family gossip, it's a risk for the firm. And the lawyer, as far as I can see, is presenting facts backed by documents." He spread his hands. "I can't interfere in your personal relationships," he continued, "but on behalf of the agency, I can say this. Until there is complete clarity about the house, you have no right to present it to anyone as a property for sale or promise any deals related to it. Is that clear?" She nodded without looking at anyone, her lips trembling. Emily gathered the documents into a neat stack. "I think we can conclude here," she said. "The goal was not to humiliate you, Veronica, but to clearly show that the inheritance fantasies you were living with do not match reality, and that the man who paid for this house for most of his life has the right not to be pushed into a nursing home for someone else's convenience." She looked at me, then back at Veronica. "What happens next will depend on how you behave at home," she said quietly. "Letters, courts, scandals, that's an unpleasant path, but it's ready if you decide to keep pressuring your father-in-law. The other path is to honestly admit that you went too far and try to part in a humane way." I sat there, listening to her words, and understood that the hardest conversation was still ahead. One thing is papers on a table and a manager across from you. It's something else entirely when, in the evening, Veronica and I would be alone again in the house where, for now, both our coats still hung on 2 hooks in the hallway, and I would have to say out loud, for the first time, that she was no longer the owner of my life. That evening, when we returned home, the silence felt louder than any shouting. The front door closed with its usual click. I hung my coat on my hook, set the bag with documents on a stool, and Veronica came in after me. She yanked off her jacket and hung it so sharply that one shoulder slipped. The fabric hung crooked, just like her mood. She stayed silent until we reached the kitchen. I put the kettle on, took 2 mugs out of the cabinet out of habit, then paused and put one back. That tiny gesture, so small it barely mattered, cut through her like a knife on glass. Fire flashed in her eyes. "So that's how it is?" She exhaled, leaning against the counter. "You don't even think it's necessary to pour me a cup anymore after what you pulled there?" I calmly took 1 mug, added tea, poured boiling water, slid it toward myself, and sat down, giving myself a few breaths before answering. "I didn't pull anything there," I said. "I simply brought documents where your last name isn't written, no matter how much you wish it were. And this is a house where Julia and I lived almost our entire lives. I'm very tired of being called a burden in it." She laughed, but the laugh came out sharp and angry. "Burden, burden," she mocked. "You latched onto that word like a nail. So all those years I ran around like a squirrel in a wheel, drove you to doctors, Ned worked nights, carried loans. That's all nothing, right? You deliberately dragged that lawyer of yours along to make me look like an idiot in front of my boss. Did you see the way he looked at me?" I took a sip, unhurried, feeling the hot tea warm my throat. "I saw it," I said. "And for many years before that, I saw the way you looked at me when you thought I didn't notice. Like a problem that needed to be gotten rid of. The sooner, the better. Just politely, with nursing home brochures and words about care." She sat across from me and stared. Her fingers nervously twisted a napkin. "You could have just talked to me," she said dully. "Without those extracts, without management, without that whole show. You knew it was already hard for me. Ned is gone. I'm alone. And you pulled the ground out from under my feet, like I'm a stranger to you." I sighed. "And do you really think that when you brought your realtor friends into my house, walked them through the rooms, talked about how you'd move me into a nursing home and sell the house, you were talking to me? Wasn't that a show too? Just staged on someone else's stage, in my home?" She looked away and said nothing. I looked at my hands, old veins, fingers that remembered cement, brick, wires, pipes, and very calmly said, "Veronica, I'm not going to argue with your pain. You really are hurting. You lost your husband, you have your fears, your bills and loans, your plans. But you chose a way of surviving where there was no place for me except the column marked extra. And now this isn't about lawyers or bosses, it's about the 2 of us. Can you accept that this house isn't yours and that I'm not obliged to go to a nursing home so you can feel free?" She jumped up from the table and paced the kitchen like an animal in a cage. "I can accept anything," she said hoarsely. "But do you understand that you're pushing me into nowhere right now? I'm not a little girl, but I'm not made of iron either. I was used to having at least this point, this house. Yes, I thought it was mine. That's what I was told. Julia said it, Ned said it. We'd rebuild the house, make it our own. I lived with that thought for years. And now you're telling me, sorry, all this time you were nobody, and your name is nothing." "No," I corrected gently. "I'm saying you're not the owner. Those are different things. And I'm also saying you went too far when you decided you had the right to decide my fate without me. And now you're surprised that your actions have consequences." She stopped, braced her hands on the windowsill, and stared into the dark window where our kitchen reflected back at us, our shoulders, our tired faces. "So what now?" she asked without turning around, her voice thinner. Will you give me those couple of months your Emily talked about at the agency? Or have you already decided? Tomorrow comes a letter, a suitcase, a train station, a room somewhere on the edge of town. I stayed quiet for a minute, listening to myself, not to irritation or small resentments, but to that quiet core that had always been there with Julia, with Ned, with this house. I'm not a monster, I said. And I don't collect other people's suffering. You'll have time, real, human time, not a week or two. You can find housing. Agencies exist for exactly that. You work in this field yourself. You have more options than half the city. But yes, I want you to leave, because I don't want to live with someone who sees me as baggage anymore. She turned sharply. So you are throwing me out, she stated flatly. I'm restoring boundaries, I answered tiredly. Those are different things. That night she slammed cabinet doors for a long time, packed things in the bedroom, rustled plastic bags. I lay in my room, listening, and thought about how many years we'd lived under one roof without really understanding each other, like two people speaking different languages. As long as Ned was between us, it wasn't so obvious. When only emptiness remains, every word sounds louder. The next day, Emily emailed me a draft notice, simple, without excess formality, but very clear. The owner of the house informs Veronica, who is living there, that after an agreed period, he asks her to vacate the house, with reasons stated, references to documents, and a careful line noting that if no agreement is reached, the matter may be taken to court. It emphasized that a reasonable time was being provided to find other housing. We printed it at her office when I stopped by again. She read it aloud, adjusted a few words so it sounded like a living person speaking rather than a cold form, then slid a pen toward me. You don't have to hand this over like a summons, she said. You can just give her the envelope in the kitchen and suggest she read it. I'm not insisting on a signature. We're not the prosecutor's office. But it would be good if later you could say in front of witnesses that the notice was given. If needed, I can confirm that I helped draft it. I signed, folded the page into an envelope, and carefully put it in my bag. The feeling was strange, like writing a letter to someone you're still living with and saying goodbye to at the same time. At home, I found Veronica on the couch in the living room. She sat with her phone in her hand, scrolling, but her face looked distant, like someone reading not text, but the emptiness between the lines. Veronica, I said, I have a letter for you. Don't be afraid. It's not a sentence, just what we've already almost said out loud, only in the language of paper. I placed the envelope on the table in front of her instead of handing it directly, so it wouldn't feel like a summons. She stared at the white rectangle for a while, then picked it up, tore the edge, pulled out the sheet, and skimmed it. Her lips tightened, then parted, as if she wanted to say something and then changed her mind. So that's how it is, she said quietly after finishing. Officially, on paper, I'm a temporary resident here, and you're generously giving me time to find somewhere else to live. And if I dig in my heels, you'll go to court. Is that it? That's it, without extra words, I confirmed. You're an adult, you know how to work, you're not drowning in debt. You have a head on your shoulders and connections. You've had choices all your life, and you used them. Use them now, too. And if I can't? She whispered. If I break down, if my nerves don't hold, will you calmly watch me fall into a hole? Veronica, I said tiredly, for years you calmly watched me being mentally carried out of this house into a nursing home, and didn't tremble in horror at that picture. And now, you suddenly expect me to clutch my heart at the thought of you moving out? Let's be more honest. I'm not your enemy, but I'm not going to keep living at the cost of my own conscience. She crumpled the sheet in her hands, then smoothed it out, looked at it again, and I could see several feelings fighting inside her at once: hurt, fear, anger, and a kind of late understanding. You still hate me, she forced out, no matter how much you say you don't. No, I shook my head. Hate is too heavy a feeling. I don't have the strength for it, and there's no point. At some point, I just stopped respecting you when I heard you call me a burden in front of strangers. And that crack, I'm afraid, won't heal. The first few days after the notice, she moved around the house like a shadow, barely speaking. Sometimes she stopped by the window, looking out at the yard, the apple trees, the old garage. Sometimes she went into my son's workshop and sat there for a long time on the chair where he used to tinker with his tools. Then another phase began, one more familiar to her. She went on the offensive, not toward me, but outward. First, from fragments of conversations, I gathered that she called a couple of friends. Complaints poured out on the other end. Through the thin bedroom door, I heard words like, "throwing me out. The old man's gone crazy. His lawyer set him on me. They're taking everything. I'm left with nothing after my husband." Then, apparently, social media got involved. One evening, my neighbor Nancy, the same one who once brought us potatoes and soup, came up to me and asked carefully, "Timothy, are you really throwing Veronica out onto the street? She's a widow, all alone. People online are already writing that you're practically kicking her out with a suitcase." I smiled, not maliciously. "Let them write," I said. "I don't live behind other people's screens. I live in this house, not in a phone. Better tell me, Nancy, can you see from your window how I'm throwing her suitcases into the street? Or is it still just talk?" She grew embarrassed and blushed. "No one's seen anything," she muttered. "It's just that Veronica's complaining. She says you and your lawyers cornered her, that the house turns out to be entirely yours, and no one warned her about anything." "That part is true," I said calmly. "The house is mine." And what exactly were Julia and I supposed to warn her about? That we weren't giving her our lives along with the gate keys? Nancy sighed. "I'm not getting involved, honestly," she admitted. "But people love stories, especially when there's a villain and a victim. So they made you the villain and her the poor innocent one." "Well then," I shook my head, "let the villain live by his own rules for once, and let the victim remember she has hands and a head, not just lips for complaints." Gradually, things quieted down. The first wave of gossip hit, broke, and passed, because no matter how you look at it, everyone lives their own life, and people don't chew on other people's problems for long. Today, it's one sensational story. Tomorrow, another. As for Veronica and me, we had our own slow tug-of-war. At first, she was sure she had me by the throat. Now she suddenly found herself on the other end of the rope, unsure whether her grip would hold. She started staying late at work more often, coming home late, sometimes with red eyes, sometimes irritated. She might slam a closet door, toss her bag onto a chair, walk past me as if I were invisible, then lock herself in her room. Other times, on the contrary, she would sit in the kitchen and suddenly start talking about difficult clients, how hard sales are now, how people haggle over every square foot, how many are trapped in mortgages and afraid to make a move. Listening to this was strange, as if the notice and the meeting at the agency had never happened. But I understood. It was her way of keeping herself from falling apart, clinging to a familiar rhythm. I saw how she gradually searched for options, calling someone about renting, scrolling through listings, discussing a room with distant relatives, and through all of it, she never once directly asked me for help, financial or otherwise, as if pride wouldn't allow it. Emily called from time to time and asked briefly, "Is she pressuring you? Trying to blackmail you with tears?" I honestly answered no. She was more likely trying to win everyone over with her misery, but not starting an open war. "And that's good," Emily said. "Then we don't need to fire in all directions yet. Just hold the boundary, Timothy. Don't give in. Kindness is wonderful, until someone starts using it against you." One evening, a distant relative of Julia's called. I'd barely seen him since the funeral. "When was the last time you even saw that poor daughter-in-law of yours?" he asked. "At Ned's funeral," he admitted. Otherwise, only through stories and photos. But you know, blood is blood. I feel sorry for the woman. Pity isn't the worst currency, I replied. But before handing it out, it wouldn't hurt to glance at the facts, not just someone else's tears. If her version is enough for you, then fine. Live with that picture. I don't owe explanations to you or to the internet. He hesitated, tried to talk about family, about keeping the peace, about not airing conflicts. I listened, nodded, then said calmly, I wasn't the one who aired it first. Veronica did, when she started telling people at her office that the house was hers and that I needed to be urgently packed off to a nursing home. No one really cared how I felt about that. And now, when I simply said no, everyone suddenly remembered that conflicts are bad. Funny. That conversation settled something inside me. I realized that, in truth, I wasn't waiting for understanding or justification from outsiders. What mattered was that when I looked at my house and into my own soul, I didn't see a coward who stayed silent while he was pushed out of his own life under pretty excuses. Meanwhile, something else happened in the city that I learned about by chance. I was walking to church, as I do every Sunday. A small group of parishioners stood by the door, some crossing themselves, some talking quietly, when a middle-aged man approached me. I didn't recognize his face, but I could tell he recognized me. "Excuse me, are you the Timothy who's suing his daughter-in-law?" he asked cautiously. "We haven't started suing yet," I said. "But yes, I'm the one the internet has already labeled a tyrant who's throwing out a widow." He looked embarrassed. "No," he said. "I actually saw another version. Your daughter-in-law complained a lot at first in a local community group, but then one of your former co-workers wrote about how you built the house, how you handled all the paperwork, how you always paid for everything yourself. Then someone else posted scans of old newspaper articles about how you repaired the power line to your house at your own expense so everyone could get electricity faster. And people in the comments suddenly went quiet. Folks love sharing someone else's grief, but almost no one wants to dig into who's right and who's wrong. When they saw the story wasn't so clear-cut, many stopped painting you as a demon." I smiled, and my chest felt lighter. "So the bonfire's postponed," I said. "I'll manage without a public burning for now." The man shrugged. "People get distracted quickly," he added. "Today they talk about you, tomorrow about someone else. The main thing is that you don't live by a script written for you by strangers." When I got home, the house smelled of stewed cabbage and something sweet, an apple pie Veronica used to make better than anyone. She stood by the stove in old house pants and a t-shirt, hair tied back, her makeup-free face looking younger than usual, and suddenly it was clear how tired we both were of playing the roles we'd pinned on each other. "Smells good," I said, taking off my jacket. "Don't get excited." She waved it off, but there was no anger in her voice. "The pie isn't a peace offering. I just needed to use up the ingredients before they went bad. You'll be living here longer anyway, and me, well, we'll see how it goes." We sat at the table and ate in silence for a while. Then she suddenly said, "I know you think I was just dreaming of kicking you out of the house so I could dance on the freed-up square footage. But that's not entirely true. Yes, I wanted space. Yes, I thought the house was rightfully mine. That's what I was told all along. And I clung to that thought like a life preserver. And when it turned out the preserver was cardboard, soaked through and falling apart, it hit me like that same girl you probably think is spoiled." I looked at her. "I think," I said quietly, "that you and I are both living people who do stupid things when we're scared, just in different ways. You grabbed onto the house and my square footage as a guarantee that you wouldn't fall into poverty and loneliness. And I stayed silent for too long so I wouldn't fight with my son, and by doing that, I let you believe I was weak and convenient. Then, when it finally hurt too much, I didn't answer in a whisper, but out loud, like in a public square. And yes, maybe that was too much as well." She raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Are you actually admitting you went too far?" she asked cautiously. "I'm admitting that I should have said no earlier," I replied. Back when you first said the word nursing home, and I pretended not to hear it, because it was easier for me to endure than to enter an open conflict. And now, when everything has come out into the open, it feels to you like I attacked, when in fact I just retreated for too long. That's all. She was silent for a long time, crumbling the edge of her pie with a fork. Then she suddenly said quietly, "And if back then, when it all started, I hadn't gone around the whole office telling everyone how I was going to move you out, but had just come to you and said, 'Dad, I'm scared. I'm afraid of being left with debts, with this huge house. I don't know how to live. Help me figure out how we can handle this together.' Would you have reacted differently?" I didn't answer right away. I pictured that scene and realized how unlikely it was that she could have done that at the time. "Maybe," I finally said. "I'm not made of iron. You know that. I know how to share. The whole family agreement was built for that. But sharing like human beings and giving everything away in exchange for a place in a nursing home are two different stories. You chose the second one, and now you're asking whether I could have chosen the first. At this point, it's already too late." She sighed and leaned back in her chair. "I signed a lease yesterday," she suddenly said, almost casually. "Paid the deposit. The landlady is fine, no surprises. I'm moving at the end of the month, so your paper will be fulfilled. You can be happy. You won." I shook my head. "I didn't win," I said quietly. "I just took back what was mine. And you, honestly, didn't lose either. You didn't end up sleeping on relatives' couches like you scared your friends with. You didn't run to the first corner you could find. You found your own place, on your own, through your work, without my wallet and without complaints. And if one day you choose to see this not as an ending, but as the beginning of some kind of life of your own, you might understand that this looks more like a draw than your collapse." She smirked. "You talk nicely," she said, "like you're reading from a book." "This isn't a book," I replied. "It's my old age, and I want to live it without someone else's plans hanging over my house." After that conversation, the air in the house seemed to become clearer. Yes, boxes multiplied. Yes, the hallway filled with her bags and packages. Yes, sometimes she snapped with irritated remarks when something didn't work out. But that nervousness no longer carried the old certainty that she had the right to command my life. And for the first time in many months, I started falling asleep calmly, without listening to every rustle, without expecting another brochure with smiling elderly couples, and the caption, "A home for your peaceful old age," to appear around the corner. One day, a couple of days before her move, a young man came to see me. I recognized him as one of those who had been at the agency that day when Emily laid out the documents. He stood awkwardly at the door, holding a bag of cookies, as if he'd come to visit a distant relative. "Sorry to come without calling," he said. "I'm one of the employees at Premier Realty. That day when you and Veronica came in, I was in the next office and heard everything. And since then, well, I wanted to tell you something, but I kept hesitating. Come in." I waved him inside. "This isn't a reception desk. The kettle is always on." We sat in the kitchen. He fidgeted with the bag, then finally let it out. "You know, we deal with a lot of stories. People sell apartments after divorces, after deaths, after all kinds of awful things. And often elderly people really are pushed aside, like you said, into nursing homes to free up space. And we, realtors, take part in that as part of the process, without thinking about what's going on inside them. But that day, when you laid out those papers and calmly said you weren't going to die on someone else's schedule, something clicked inside me. I thought about my parents, about my grandmother who lives outside the city. Honestly, after that day I started looking at those deals differently. Sometimes I refuse them if I see things are really dirty. And I wanted to thank you for that. You probably didn't plan it, but you didn't just defend your own boundaries, you held up a mirror for all of us. I smiled at his embarrassed face. "Well," I said, "if my quiet old man war for my house helped even one person stop in time, then I didn't live my life for nothing." When he left, I heard a rustle in the hallway. Veronica was standing in the doorway of her room, leaning her shoulder against the frame. It was unclear how much of our conversation she had heard, but her eyes looked different, without their former sharpness. "So now you're educating realtors too," she said. "Wasn't I enough for you?" "Life has been educating me for a long time," I smiled tiredly. "If someone else gets a lesson along the way, I don't see the harm." She was quiet for a moment, then suddenly added softly, "I'll move at the end of the week. I agreed it with the landlady. Some furniture is already there. I'll pack the rest. Don't worry, I won't drag it out to the last day. I'm sick of these suitcases in the hallway myself. It's hard to look at." "That's your choice," I nodded. "I won't rush you or hold you back. I'll just say one thing. When you leave, put the keys on the hook where they've been all these years. Everything else is up to you." She nodded in response, and at that moment, I understood that our tug-of-war was over. The rope hadn't snapped. We had simply both let go of our ends because there was no strength left to pull. All that remained was to wait for the day she would step over the threshold with her last bag, and I would stay in the house alone, but no longer as a burden, rather as a man who refused to be quietly packed into someone else's script. On the day Veronica actually left, the morning was a plain, homey gray, without sun or ceremony. Just an ordinary November sky under which people go to work, children drag their backpacks to school, old folks take out the trash and think about what to cook for lunch. And only for the two of us was it a morning when one story ended and another began, separately, for each of us. The hallway was filled with boxes, bags, packages, but there was no chaos anymore. Everything was labeled, neatly packed, tied up. You could see she hadn't packed in panic, but methodically, with a list, with sense. There turned out to be fewer things than it seemed when they were scattered around the house. A couple of boxes of clothes, a few with dishes, 2 with books and papers, some electronics. Everything else was cosmetics and small items that somehow stick to you over the years. I stood in the hallway, pretending to be busy with my slippers, adjusting the lace on my old boots, though in reality, I was listening to how she took one last look around the room, how her gaze lingered on the table, the windowsill, the closet door. Then she came out, bag in one hand, jacket in the other, stopped in the middle of the hallway, and looked at me as if she had wanted to say something for a long time, but never found the words. "The car will be here in a couple of minutes," she said. "A colleague is helping me move the boxes. After that, I'll manage on my own." "All right," I nodded. "Be careful on the stairs. The boxes are heavy. Your back will remember." She gave a crooked smile. "You're impossible, as always," she said. "Instead of good luck, it's your back will remember." "Oh well." There was a pause. Then, as if forcing herself, she reached for the hook by the door and took down the key ring, the same one that had hung there for years, like part of the decor. She carefully removed the small keychain Ned had once attached, placed it on the shelf, and hung the keys back on the very hook where they had always been, next to mine. "Just like you said," she said quietly, "leaving them where they belong. The house is yours. You'll be the one living with it now." I looked at the keys, at her hand, at the way her fingers had gone pale, and suddenly realized that for her, this wasn't just metal clinking. It was letting go of the last illusion she had been holding on to. "Veronica," I said, "wait a minute." She flinched slightly, as if ready to say, "Please don't start another lecture," but stayed silent, only exhaling through her nose. "I won't take more of your time," I began. "I'll just say one thing that you may only truly hear in a couple of years, but at least you'll hear it honestly. I'm not happy that you're leaving. I'm simply relieved that this decision was made honestly, without lies, without tricks, without nursing homes and stories about being a burden. I didn't build this house as a prison or as scenery for someone else's plans. I built it as a place where a person should feel at peace. And what we had instead was a constant fight for air. That's all." She stayed quiet, looking from me to the floor. I know you won't forgive me now, and maybe never will, I continued, for all those conversations, for the word burden, for trying to decide for you how you should live. But it matters to me that you understand this. I'm not closing the door to you forever. If one day you truly need help, not another attempt to live at someone else's expense, you know where to find me. Just come as an adult, honestly, without fairy tales about who owes whom what. Then we can talk. She smiled, tired but genuine. You're talking like Julia right now, she said softly. I remember how she once told me that respect for people is something you can't force out of them. It either exists or it dies, and then nothing can bring it back. I just shrugged back then. Pretty words, I thought. She looked up at me. I'm sorry, if you even have the strength to hear that word, she breathed out. I really went too far, more than once. Sometimes it felt like if I didn't claw this house out for myself right now, I'd fall through, that no one would save me, that the world works so that the one who grabs first survives, not the one who builds. And I didn't notice how I myself became like those clients you hate seeing when you're a realtor. I sighed and looked at the old doormat by the door, the one where Ned once dropped a can of paint. I stopped being the keeper of other people's forgiveness a long time ago, I said. But if my words make it easier for you, then yes, I hear you. And yes, I understand that you were scared. Fear just doesn't justify trying to push a person out of their own life. That's where I drew the line. A car honked outside. Veronica flinched, as if pulled out of a dream. All right, she said. If I start crying now, it'll be awkward for both of us. And I don't want you to remember me like that. I've already done enough foolish things. She stepped toward the door, then suddenly turned back and quickly, unexpectedly, hugged me. Not like a daughter, not like a loving relative, but like someone who, at the very last moment, realized that a lot of this had been real after all, even if strange. She hugged me tightly, briefly, then pulled away, awkwardly wiping the corner of her eye with her palm. Take care of yourself, old man, she muttered. And please, don't give your place in this house to anyone until you decide it's time. I've learned that much, I replied. Thanks for at least saying not a burden in the end. She smirked, turned, picked up her bag, and stepped out onto the landing. The door closed softly behind her, without a slam, and for the first time in a long while, I heard a kind of silence in the house that carried no hint of an approaching fight. For the first few days, I walked through the rooms like through a museum of my own life, not because it was easier, but because a house after someone leaves always lives with a special echo, where every shelf holds the shadow of someone's cup, and every corner waits with a habit that doesn't yet know it's been canceled. I cleaned the empty room that used to be Ned and Veronica's bedroom, put the remaining small items into a separate box, thinking that maybe one day I'd give them back if asked. If not, then they weren't needed. Emily called a few days later and asked briefly, "Gone?" "Gone," I answered. "Scenes, threats, drama?" "No," I said. "Just boxes, a taxi, and a couple of honest words at goodbye." Surprisingly, the world didn't collapse. "Thank God," she sighed. "Then let's finish what we started. I've prepared an addition to your will. I don't want to pressure you, but while you're of sound mind and clear memory, it's worth fixing on paper what you've already decided for yourself." We met again at her office, at the same desk with the same lamp, but this time there was no tension in her voice, the kind there had been when we were preparing to go to the agency. Everything was already done. All that was left was to put a final mark on paper. "Look," she said, showing me the new pages. "Here we fix that after your death, the house and the main part of your savings will not go through the standard line of inheritance, but into the charitable framework you mentioned. Part to the church, part to helping the elderly at that same golden sunset, so that people end up there not because their children got rid of them, but because they truly have no one else to help them." She looked up at me. "And you're still leaving Veronica a small amount," she continued. Not a huge sum, but not a symbolic dollar either. Enough so it doesn't feel like you erased her from your life. This line reads, "As a sign of gratitude for the years spent in my family and in memory of my son Ned." You insisted on that, if I remember correctly. That's right, I nodded. I don't want to take revenge with dead pieces of paper. I just don't want to live under someone else's expectations anymore. I signed, and in that moment felt a strange sense of relief, as if I had drawn a boundary not only for myself, but for Veronica as well, one she would never cross again, and at the same time hadn't slammed the door in her face forever. Life went on, slowly, like winter water around here, sometimes a thin stream, sometimes frozen solid, then moving again. I went to the store, tightened old outlets, and in spring went back into the garden to prune the apple trees and dig in the beds. 2 neighbor girls helped take out the trash and got apples and a mug of compote in return. Sometimes we sat on the bench, and they listened to me talk about how the house had been built. Sometimes, closer to summer, Veronica sent short messages, no hysteria, no demands. "How are you? Haven't you died of boredom in your quiet neighborhood?" I replied in the same tone, dry, but not unkind. Occasionally we called each other to clarify some small detail from Ned's past, where a certain document was kept, where he had put some childhood drawings she suddenly wanted to find. Once, closer to fall, she asked to meet, not at the house, not at the agency, but in a small cafe downtown where, as she put it, the coffee was decent and other people's conversations drowned out your own thoughts. She arrived early, already sitting by the window with a mug in her hands. On the table lay her new set of keys, from the rental apartment, the office, and something else. Her gaze was calmer than before. The fatigue hadn't gone anywhere, but that constant inner tension, "I must hold everything together," was gone. In its place, there was a kind of sobriety. "So, how's life without my burden?" She smirked when I sat down. "Quieter," I replied, "but the air is cleaner. And you know, sometimes it's useful to hear only your own footsteps in your house, just to understand whether you yourself have become a burden." We talked for a long time, not about money, not about wills, not about houses, but about Ned, about funny moments, about how he was afraid of the dark as a kid and later laughed at himself for it, about how she first brought him to the agency, where people looked at him like a child, and how a couple of years later, he was already advising on the best way to show clients a floor plan. There was no attempt in these conversations to bring the past back. Rather, it was what we never managed to do while he was alive. Talk normally, like adults, without fighting over territory. When we were about to part, she suddenly said, "You know, I've been thinking that maybe you were right when you said respect isn't something you can bargain for. I tried to buy my peace of mind with your old age, and then got offended when I didn't get the product I expected. I should have understood earlier that this isn't how it works." I looked at her hands, which no longer nervously twisted the strap of her bag. "The important thing is that you understand it now," I said. "In life, being late with wisdom isn't fatal, as long as you're not late with your conscience. That part is harder to fix." We went our separate ways, and I knew there would be no miraculous reconciliation where we hugged and lived happily ever after. And thank God for that. I'm not from a fairy tale to expect endings like that. Still, somewhere inside, that crack which once seemed impossible to heal had quietly closed. Now it was just a scar, no longer painful, but a reminder of what had been. At home, the same house was waiting for me. White brick, the garden, the old wardrobe, the kitchen with its faded countertop, everything just as it had been for years. Only now, within these walls, the word burden was no longer aimed at me, and no one else's brochures with smiling seniors lay around. Sometimes I think that maybe one day I really will need a place like that. A home for the elderly, with nurses walking the corridors, Newspapers read aloud in the evenings for those who can no longer see well, and people looking out the window because they have nowhere else to go. And that thought isn't so frightening anymore, because I know this. If I ever end up there, it won't be because someone sent me away for their own convenience, but because I decided it myself. And maybe somewhere there, a pillow already lies, bought with my donations. For now, I live here, in the house I built back in the years when grass was cut with a scythe and decisions were made without checking the internet. And the one thing I've firmly learned from all this is simple. Old age doesn't take away a person's right to say no, no matter how many years they have lived, and no matter how nicely those smile who want to arrange your life for their own comfort. To be honest, that no is sometimes enough for me now, so that waking up in my room, looking at the familiar ceiling, I can quietly say to myself, yes, still my house, still my life. And I don't owe anyone pretending that it's cramped for me here. If you enjoyed this story, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.